Today, I want to talk about naming conventions in Linux. It's something a lot of people tend to avoid, but can make your life a lot easier if you start using them. Personally, I believe there's wrong and right ways of doing this. And today I hope to shed some light on some of the ways you can use naming conventions or schemes in order to make for better organization on your Linux systems, as well as your development. First off, we're getting into why even use naming conventions. Then we're going to talk about a few types of naming conventions, and I'll go into one of my production systems and actually show you what my current naming scheme is and how I would personally suggest naming, or at least how it's worked best for me, and leave you with some final thoughts on whether or not you want to make the switch. First off, when talking about naming conventions, why do we need them? Well, one important reason is just simply improved readability. Just like when it's hard to read someone's handwriting, it can be very hard to read people's files and what's actually intended in a name if you don't have a scheme or convention. Number two, it gives you consistency. If you don't remain consistent across your systems, how do you expect someone else to be able to understand your files and what exactly they mean, which can save you time and effort in the long run, especially if you're working on a team. Consistency really matters. Another thing that a naming convention does is it provides a rule set that enables you to get past common technical pitfalls, which will make your life harder, especially when you're searching things in the future on the system. It can get really frustrating when you're trying to find a file and you just can't find it, and it's simply because of the way that you name things on your system. I've ran into this many times, and I've really had to get better about the consistency over the years, which has really improved the fourth thing, which is simply command line usability and searchability. It's been too many times where I come back on a project and I totally forget what a file name was called, and I start searching for it without a proper naming scheme. Good luck trying to find that file. Same thing with the command line usability. If you have weird characters or a weird naming convention, it might be very hard to use commands. We're going to get into some of these commands in a little bit, but let's talk about types of naming conventions. So this time, we're actually looking at types of naming conventions. There's a few types, but I'm going to share with you what I think personally is the best type and which works for me. The first off is snake case. This is where you use underscores instead of spaces to actually subdivide multiple words. It's very commonly used, and in some programming languages, it's actually preferred as they don't allow you to use the next one, which would be camel case, where we have a capital letter and we avoid spaces altogether. There is no space between two words here. Camel case, and you capitalize every word that you come across instead of using spaces. The next one is spaces. Now, a lot of us use this, especially when we're creating folders on the desktop, because it's just easy. It's effortless. You start typing and it's very convenient to hit the space bar and make a name. I do not suggest using this one at all. No spaces allowed. Let's make that a rule if we're going to use a naming convention, especially when we get into the command line and making various different projects. I'll explain why in a bit, but finally, I want to talk about the last one that I'm considering at least, which is kebab case. Kebab case is very similar to snake case, just the fact that you use hyphens instead of underscores. Between each word that occurs in a name of a file, you would use a dash or hyphen. These are probably the most used types of naming conventions. Now, there are more, of course, and we could probably go all day describing the benefits and reasons not to use these naming conventions, but I'm only going to focus on these few. So my suggestion, if you haven't been using one of these two conventions, I highly suggest using this. First off, it really helps with readability. Where naturally you'd want to put a space, using a character that kind of looks like or symbolizes a space is important. And this is mainly for one very simple reason. Spaces. Whenever you use them in a command line environment, they tend to break command line tools or scripts. And last but not least, it just makes it a lot harder to search for files, as a system doesn't know how to interpret a space because it considers this a very special character. So in order to avoid those special characters, we can use ones it doesn't really care about, which again are hyphens or underscores. And my personal favorite is the kebab case. Not only do I like eating kebabs, but I do like the way this looks. The main reasons I like the kebab case. But before we do, make sure to take a moment, and if you're enjoying this video, smash that like button for me so more people learn about these naming conventions and what really makes sense in the command line. We're going to get deep into this, so you might want to subscribe below for more videos like this in the future, as you wouldn't want to miss another one. Before I make the kebab case, I need to talk about camel case. Camel case gets really confusing really quick. It doesn't have a much distinction between the words. Well, at least not as much as the snake case or kebab case. So I really tend to avoid this. This sometimes can be used in programming, but again, I mainly avoid this at all costs. I just don't think it has good enough readability in order to really make sense to use. Let's talk about why kebab case. As if I do list my project here, we'll notice I've started using it. This is what I mean by kebab case. I have many different portions of code that all run a claw machine. That's why they're labeled by claw dash something, right? Claw, camera, machine, stream, socket, bot, so on and so forth. I don't like to capitalize things. I like to keep everything lowercase. Nothing really needs to be emphasized here. And this makes it much easier to identify, search, and organize my files. We're going to go into more depth here, but back to why I like kebab case personally. Now, again, I'm not trying to go against snake case here. It's a good choice as well. If you prefer that one, absolutely go with it. But I do suggest picking one of the two. The main reason here that I like kebab case, at least for my own eyes, is that it's just easier to read. My eyes don't tend to drift down as much in order to actually read files when I do them in kebab case versus snake case. Let's just do a brief example. Clear things out, and then reading from left to right, which one can you read better? Some very long named file.txt or some underscore very long named file.txt. Now, if you say it's about the same reading either one of these, well, then let's go to the next question or argument. How long does it take you to type these individually? Go take a moment, write it out with your keyboard, and get a feel for which one takes longer. The one that takes less time is probably the one that you want to go with. Efficiency is very important. As we all like to get through things quicker and remain productive, let's not waste extra time pressing keys on a keyboard, trying to find our footing. Use the one that feels more natural to you. With that aside, now I'm going to talk and show you how I use camel case and why I use camel case for my files in my naming convention. I'm just going to go into a folder here, so claw-machine, and I'm going to list things out. You'll notice here that node underscore modules shows up with an underscore. Well, Nick, you just said you use dashes instead of underscores. Well, sadly, the rule breaks down in a few cases. One case is when you're actually programming, a lot of languages tend to prefer the underscore. But I want to make an argument that that's a big reason why you can use the hyphen to better split programs and programming from system administration and more of the IT-based work. It gives you a little bit of a clearer distinction. This right here, node modules, is not because I wanted to create something with an underscore. This is because when I created the project, this was automatically created by the project setup process. This is something that Node.js prefers for the naming scheme. That way, when I created this node project, boom, it created a node modules where it keeps all the node modules in. But at the same token, we have package-lock.json. So whoever was creating this is using two different types of naming conventions anyway. So it's not always going to be perfect, as when we get to a project or corporate level, the scalability and efficiency becomes harder and harder to deal with because you have tons of people working all on file scripts and directories together, which just makes it even more important to really get down a naming convention. But anyways, I wanted to make you aware of this, as well as some languages that really do not like using anything else than snake case. For example, breakdowns of variables, function names, file names. Well, languages like Python, Rust, and C all really prefer snake case. Actually, if you try to use a hyphen in some of these for the variable name, it would actually give you errors because it's a syntax restriction. Same thing with functions. Python, Rust, and C all prefer snake case when it comes to this scenario. And finally, file names with these types of projects as well, they'll push you towards using, again, snake case, just like we saw with some of the node directories. But this one really doesn't matter, as you can use either case. It's not going to lead to a syntax error. So it might feel like it's going against the grain here. I like separating my environments anyway. When I program, I tend to use things like snake case or camel case even, but we're not getting into that. We want to search a Linux file system here and use this naming convention in Linux. So let's make our first folder, make directory, and I'm going to create it right here. I'm going to call it naming/convention. I want to show some things off. So we're going to change directories into naming convention. Notice how it automatically fills things in. So if I change directories, fantastic. Well, what if I did that with the space? Let's see how that works. So I'm going to actually create a directory, and this is going to be completely different. It's just going to be called naming convention. Notice that I had to use quotes on either side. Why is that? Well, if I didn't, this command would actually fail. So now that I did that, there is a naming convention folder as well, but look how ugly this looks. It's between quotes. That's because the system considers this a special character, and now we have to really specify that this is a string. It cannot make that distinction by itself like it could over here. So now if I want to change directories into naming convention, notice I have to press tab a few times and I get these two options. Well, what if I do space? Now it gets messed up and it says, oh, you put a space in, there's nothing here with naming and space, because it's considering this a whole different argument for change directory CD. Now you're starting to see why using spaces is very confusing. Okay, so I have naming convention. How am I going to get to this one? Well, if I do CD and I did naming, and now if I do tabs, I can actually use it with quotes. As long as I specify the quotes, now it's going to recognize this new folder. But it just takes so much longer to type all that out. Why would you want to do that? Instead, if I do CD, naming, dash, and boom, it's here. And that's how much better that is. But that's just one example. Both make directory and change directory are very simple showings of just how much easier having a naming convention makes it to navigate the system. But what if you wanted to find a file? Let's create files in here as well. We're going to do touch and just do file-name.txt. Then I'm going to do something very similar in the other folder with the space. So here I'm going to do touch, and again I have to use the parentheses, and then I'm going to create file space name.txt. Again, I have to use quotes around all that. Let me just make sure that I actually created it in naming convention. Very good. It exists with a space. Well, now let's say I have forgotten where that file exists. There's amazing commands to find these things. But if I wanted to, for example, find a name, well, I can use the find command followed by a name. And if I know what the file name is called, because it's just somewhere on my system, I could be like, oh yeah, file with an asterisk, and let's see if it can find some stuff here. Well, there's quite a few. That's probably not the best example. We had text then, so that should help us. All right, it found both of these. Well, now I can easily go to this. I'm going to copy this, and I'm just going to go CD, paste, because I don't want to type everything out. And look at that, too many arguments. Well, why? Well, it's because of the space. I need quotes around this again. And it doesn't give you quotes around these types of things when you're searching. So using find just to find a file somewhere on the system becomes a lot easier if you just use a specific naming convention without spaces. So if I just did CD, paste, enter, now I get a different error because I'm trying to change directories instead of open the file. Let's just say I wanted to open the file. Here we go. Great. And if I wanted to open the other file, can I do it? Vim, boom. I can't because it created a whole new file. Notice down here, don't get this mixed up because this would have tricked you. If I save, let's first just write something in this file. I'm gonna save and exit, and now I got a mess. There's a new naming file right here, which is something, and that's not where I wanted to create it. But I also go into here, and now this file name has nothing in it because it never got changed because we changed and created the wrong file. Basically, when you use Vim and it doesn't find a file, it assumes you want to create the file. I'm gonna remove naming here, and that should be good enough. And now you're getting kind of a sense for why to not use spaces, because it's inefficient. So no spaces because of inefficiency. And these inefficiencies are going to show up in things like the copy command, the find command, grepping, or finding a text pattern, move, remove, and many, many more basic and standard commands. Why make your life harder? Make things easier by using a proper naming convention. Now let's go into another nightmare scenario, at least for me. So you work for a company, there's hundreds of people, if not thousands of people. Everyone uses a similar server. People put file names in, and no one cares about what they call things. So a lot of the time, you're not just going to have this goofy deal here. You're going to have revisions, for example, file 1 text, final file version 3.txt, final file. And reading these things is going to become a nightmare. I mean, just try going across here and reading these. It just doesn't look natural to the eye. And that's not even with adding spaces in. We have a space here, and look how different this looks than these other ones. This is another important part of just remaining consistent and working with others to improve readability. By only doing a few things, it makes everyone's lives easier because when they're searching for things or when they're moving things around, when they're naming, they know the rules behind this now. And if everyone follows the same rules, everyone's lives become much easier. And there's no questions about what's the correct way to do it. You have a naming convention. Another argument that I would create is if we clear things out, and notice in this example, we had uppercase and caps for some of the file names. Well, let's go back one directory and go into our favorite dash naming convention. When creating a file name, don't use uppercase or caps. This will avoid issues with any case insensitive systems, which all that means is when operations like searching, matching, and comparing text, basically case insensitive would mean these two files would be treated exactly the same when trying to find them because they're considered the exact same file. For example, Windows actually is case insensitive by default. You're not supposed to have two files named the same in the same directory. For that example, just think of file.txt and file.txt, one with an uppercase F. Those are the exact same file. Linux, however, is smart enough to handle this. They consider that two separate files. But regardless, to remain consistent and to never run into that problem, use lowercase only, avoid spaces, and don't name your files the same exact thing. That's a big no-no. I've already been harping on all the facts of just trying to avoid spaces at all costs, which can be unnatural at first. But as you can tell, it saves you a lot of headache in the future. Also, avoid special characters. I know people like to get fancy, but special characters, especially in Linux, mean something. Symbols like exclamation point, question mark, colon, $, slashes, and others all are used in special cases on the system. I'm going to show you a few real quick. If I do exclamation point here, that actually reruns the last command, which is a fantastic thing if you miss something like sudo, for example. So if I did apt update, if I did sudo and then did 2 exclamation points, that would rerun things properly by attaching a sudo up in front. So I want you to be very wary of using those types of characters. Another thing, in Bash, some of these symbols are used for things like the variables on the system. If I wanted to spit out what the home directory is, I could do echo space $home. This is a valid scripting code in Linux, and it's going to give you the home user's directory because this is a variable and there's many of them. So do not use $. We can keep going on for quite a while, but I think you understand why it makes no sense to use symbols, especially in file paths, commands, and file names. Again, I keep harping on the fact that consistency is key. Use one or the other, hyphens or underscores, not both, and just keep maintaining consistency. That way you get great at one and you don't mess up. Now you might be asking yourself, sometimes I like to put dates in my files. This is perfectly fine if you have a format for it. So for example, if you wanted to know that file name belonged to a certain date when you created it, you can do that. Just append with a hyphen the year, the month, and the day. So this is January 3rd, 2025. Never use colons, as you might see in some date formats. It just doesn't work well. So this file name is still very readable and it makes a lot of sense. I'll give you some other examples of good file names. Let's say you have a project you're working on. Maybe it's a application that you have that you're releasing. For example, app-version 1.0.0.log is perfectly acceptable. This is a common naming scheme for applications to follow what version that you're currently on and gives you 3 bits of information and what major version you're on, version 1, what minor version you're on, 0, and which patch version you're on, 0. And a lot of systems use it like this. And finally, .log appended to the back just means that it's a file associated more than likely for operations or events for debugging. This is a perfectly great file name, as dots are very accepted in Linux and the naming conventions for files in Linux. You'll even notice some of the kernel development uses a naming convention like this and ensures version control with predictable naming patterns, especially in collaborative environments. Let's say you're working for a company or something, where having many different versions can really throw things off and become a nightmare if you don't have consistency in your naming. There's been many times where in a project like this, where I have hundreds and hundreds of files, I step away from it, come back months later, and I need to find files. I tend to remember the file name, but I don't necessarily know where it was located. This naming convention makes it a lot easier for me to find those files. And not only find those files, but also search through the files because I do a lot of copying pasting. It only becomes more and more critical as you work in team and large systems or large projects. You're going to get lost And you're really going to hate it when you have to start putting quotes around everything in order to actually change to that file or even reference that file. The absolute worst culprit is when you start trying to include these types of folders and files in the programs themselves. It's inevitable that you're going to have to reference something on the system. So if I wanted to reference this from the root directory, I would first have to go into the home user SavvyDev directory and reference naming convention. Well, now the system's not too happy because I really should have put quotes around this in order to signify that I'm about to put a space in, which is annoying because it gives very weird results. If I hit it again outside the quotes, now it tries to escape the space. It makes things even more confusing when you go to try use this in a program because it will not recognize an escape character like this. Instead, it actually needed the quotes around it. And now you've seen the chain of errors that this has produced by just trying to copy in a path with a space. I'm mainly just trying to get you ahead of the game. As for myself, I've been using this convention for many years now in development. And I remember being very frustrated at the beginning of things with just searching an organization and trying to identify where things were located on the Linux system and project and I've been working on. So I figured I'd share this with you today, just highlight some of the importance of naming conventions. And my final thought is just choose a standard and stick to it. Even if it's using spaces, whatever. Don't get too far into the weeds with this. The important part here is that you have some sort of system for naming. Otherwise, you're going to start getting lost in the system and in your projects. If you found this video helpful, take a moment to subscribe below. I'm glad you made it to the end. Share it with somebody, as well as hit the like button so it gets out to more people. Let me know what you thought about the rules here for my naming convention and which one you personally use, if you use one at all, in the comments section below. Catch me in a great community on Discord, and I'll catch you in another video. Thanks for watching. Linux can be hard to understand, but I take the most commonly used terms, commands, and subjects in Linux and I break them down into simple to read documents, including Linux terms, flashcards, a checklist, a cheat sheet, and a mind map. And if you're ready to level up your Linux experience and knowledge, go to SavvyNik.com now and get access to these sheets.